Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, August 18th, 2016. And there's some shakeups going on in the Kremlin. In fact, I just received this article from Mr. VT, and it went right to the head of the list. And I thought I would talk about this in today's video blog, because the shakeup is more confirmation that Putin and his advisors are simply not going to play globalism's ball game. All right. Now, I've been advocating for several years, watching Mr. Putin, watching the Russian Federation, and particularly a certain segment of advisors around him. I've been advocating for many years that Russia is really the first post-modern state. It had its experiment with galloping secularism under the Soviet Union. It had experiment with globalism under the Yeltsin regime, and we know how that ended. Basically, the West just went in to plunder, along with the old communist nomenclatura, who became the oligarchs, to plunder Russia. And I want you to also listen to this article in the context of what's going on in the American elections, where if you listen to the American media, both on the mainstream, on American talk radio, and so on, this is being presented as a contest between globalism and populism by some commentators. And it's as if the only selection that we have are either protectionism in economic terms or absolute free market, and we know what that's done. It's shipped everyone's jobs overseas and is gradually collapsing the middle class. And Mr. Putin sees this, all right? And I want to read this article to you. It's called "Putin Okays Economic Nationalists Who Opposed Globalist Policies." This is an article by F. William Engdahl, one of my favorite researchers. I've linked it for you because it's quite lengthy. I'm only going to be selecting certain passages here to bring to your attention, but there's some very, very good information here. And if this is the course, as it appears to be, that Mr. Putin is on, it's going to be very interesting a few years down the line to go back and look at Russia's performance vis-a-vis the West. The West's economy is stagnating as well under all of this so-called free trade. Now, listen carefully. I'm reading the first three paragraphs. I'm going to skip around a lot in this article, but I'm going to take things in order. Mr. Engdahl writes, after more than 2 years of worsening economic growth and an economy struggling with 10.5% central bank interest rates that make new credit to spur growth virtually impossible, Russian President Vladimir Putin has finally broken an internal factional standoff. On July 25th, he mandated that an economic group called the Stolypin Club prepare their proposals to spur growth revival to be presented to the government by the fourth quarter of this year. In doing so, Putin has rejected two influential liberal or neoliberal economic factions that had brought Russia into a politically and economically dangerous recession with their liberal Western free market ideology. Now, it's kind of hard to have free markets and liberalism when everybody's imposing sanctions on you. So, that would seem to be rather obvious. But anyway, to continue. This is a major development, and one I had been expecting since I had the possibility to exchange views this June in St. Petersburg at the annual St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. In their comment, Kathion notes the major significance of the decision to drop the clearly destructive neoliberal or free market approach of former Finance Minister Alexei Kudrin. Quote, the Stolypin Club report advises to increase the investment, pumping up the economy with money from the state budget. In other words, it's a Keynesian sort of approach here, folks, and by the issue of the Bank of Russia. In turn, the concept of the Center for Strategic Research, or that of former Finance Minister Alexei Kudrin, suggested that investment should be private, and the state is to ensure macroeconomic stability, low inflation, and reduced budget deficit. Now, I'm skipping several paragraphs here down to the bottom of page 2 of this article. Just 2 months later, Putin has obviously decided. He clearly has an eye as well to Russia's next presidential elections in March 2018. In doing so, he has selected the one group of the three on the Economic Council that believes that the state has a positive role to play in the development of the national economy. The Stolypin group, listen carefully, folks, this is so very, very important. Pardon me. What Mr. Engdahl is pointing out here. This is crucially important. The Stolypin group, in many ways, harkens back to the genius behind the German economic miracle after 1871. That was when Prussia unified Germany and created the German Empire, whose ideas created the most impressive economic growth from backwardness in all Europe within just over 3 decades. The only other countries to come near to that German economic achievement were the United States after 1865 and the People's Republic of China after 1979, with the Deng Xiaoping, quote, socialism with Chinese characteristics, unquote. The national economic development model is based on the work of a now all but unknown 19th century German national economist. Notice the word nation keeps recurring here. Friedrich List, the developer of the basic model of national economic development. In other words, it's a kind of free market, but it's also the government making sure that your industry and your economic development is protected. Now, we're going to find out in a moment how that worked in Imperial Germany's case. During the shock therapy years of Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s, Harvard economists like Jeffrey Sachs, financed by meta plunderer George Soros, and let's stop right there. Let's remember that there's evidence coming out now that Soros is behind, at least partially, helping drive the immigration crisis in Europe, and that it was Soros, through a non-government organization, that helped the Maidan revolution in the Ukraine that installed a bunch of neo-fascists and so on in Kiev. Now, do you think Russia would have cause for concern about that, given the fact that they had to fight a war with these people for 4.5 years? I think that might have something to do with Russia's response. So in other words, the plundering economy, the globalist version of free trade, when you move in, you move out the manufacturing base, and then you basically harvest the wealth of the country for the very few at the top through currency manipulations and manipulated crises. This is what Putin is now taking direct aim at. All right, let me continue. The disastrous policies of Yeltsin's economic team, then led by Yegor Gaidar, implemented wholesale privatization of state assets at dirt cheap prices to Western investors like Soros. They made drastic state budget reduction, cuts in living standards, elimination of old age pensions of the population. So in other words, we're looting your country and robbing you of the social network that the governments had put into place. All this was done in the name of free market reform. After that trauma, beginning with Putin's first presidency in 1999, Russia slowly began a painful recovery, not because of the Gaidar Harvard shock therapy, but rather despite it, a tribute to the determination of the Russian people. As astonishing as it might seem, those free market ideologues, followers of the late Gaidar, until now have had a virtual monopoly over policies of the economics and finance ministries of Russia. Now, let me jump forward here. The third group, now please notice this is a third thing here. It's between free market globalism on the one hand and absolute protectionism on the other, all right? There's a third thing here going on, and this is represented by the Stolypin group. The third group represented was one of the most Western observers ridiculed and dismissed, with the U.S. Pentagon-linked Stratfor referring to them as, quote, a strange collective, unquote. I've personally met and talked with them, and they are hardly strange to anyone with a clear moral mind. Friedrich List's views were increasingly integrated into the German Reich economic strategy beginning under the Zollverein, or German Customs Union, in 1834 that unified one German internal domestic market. It created the basis by the 1870s for the most colossal emergence of Germany as an economic rival, exceeding Britain in every area by 1914. And incidentally, folks, that's true. This is the reason that World War I took so long, because they were literally fighting this economic colossus in the center of Europe. This third group, the Stolypin group, in its May 2016 meeting, included Sergei Glaziev. Now, let me stop again and point out who Sergei Glaziev is, because I mentioned a quotation of his at the very beginning of my book, The Third Way. Glaziev is the economic advisor within Russia that said, our problem isn't the Nazis in Kiev. Our problem is the Nazis in Washington. All right, now, put all of that into the context of what this article has already said about the role of George Soros looting and plundering the Ukraine and attempting to do the same in Russia and driving his connections to the immigration crisis in Europe, plus his background. And you'll see now why Glaziev is saying the things that he's saying. All right. Now, this Stolypin group, in other words, includes Sergei Glaziev and Boris Titov, co-chair of Business Russia and Russia's business ombudsman since the creation of that post in 2012. Both Titov and Glaziev, an advisor to Putin on the Ukraine and other matters, are founding members of the Stolypin Club in Russia. In 2012, Glaziev was named by Putin, then Prime Minister, to coordinate the work of federal agencies in developing the customs union of Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia, today the Eurasian Economic Union. In other words, they're creating the Zollverein so that goods and services can move freely without tariffs or taxes between those three regions. This is why the West is saying that Putin is attempting to recreate the Soviet Union. He's trying to do nothing whatsoever. He's simply trying to get the economy in that region of the world moving, and that in conjunction with the Chinese Silk Road projects. Titov, the leader of the Right Cause Party, is a successful Russian entrepreneur who in recent years has turned to work advancing serious economic policies within the state, often in vocal opposition to Kudrin's free market liberal ideas. Now, let me skip down again in this article, and these will be the last two paragraphs. In 1990, the first priority of Washington and the International Monetary Fund was to pressure Yeltsin and the Duma to privatize the State Bank of Russia under a constitutional amendment that mandated the new Central Bank of Russia, like the Federal Reserve or European Central Bank, be a purely monetarist entity whose only mandate is to control inflation and stabilize the ruble. In effect, money creation in Russia was removed from state sovereignty and tied to the US dollar. Bingo, ding, ding, ding. Glaziev's 2015 plan proposed to use the central bank resources to provide targeted lending for businesses and industries by providing them with low subsidized interest rates between 1% and 4%, made possible by quantitative easing to the tune of 20 trillion rubles over a 5-year period. The program also suggested that the state support private business through the creation of reciprocal obligations for the purchase of products and services with agreed upon prices. In other words, what we had under the Glaziev plan was kind of a revival of the way the autocracy, the czars, eventually got rid of serfdom. The states would float low-interest loans to the serfs to buy their own land and farm it, and the government would then subsidize their prosperity by buying their products and helping them market it. So in other words, this is trying to create currency flow, money flow inside of Russia. As well, Glaziev proposed that the ruble build up its strength as an alternative to the de facto bankrupt dollar system by buying gold currency as its current currency backing. He proposed that the central bank be mandated to buy all gold production of Russian mines at a given price in order to increase the ruble gold backing. Russia today is the world's second largest gold producer, I think, after China. Obviously, Russia's president has realized that whatever impressive advances Russia makes in the foreign policy area can be fatally undercut by a failing economy, Russia's Achilles heel. The July 25th announcement by Putin has the potential to reverse that if done with resolution on all levels. There, the president has a responsibility to clearly lay out the strategy over the coming 5 years. By giving the population a clear vision of the future, he can tap into the remarkable Russian human resources to literally accomplish the impossible in turning the economy into a genuine prosperity-based economy on sounder foundation than that of the monetarist laissez-faire West, which is today de facto bankrupt. So in other words, Putin is reviving the great Listian experiment. And I suspect that if this is successful, it's not going to happen, obviously, all at once. But if you look at that period from the unification of Germany in 1871, as Mr. Engdahl points out, up to the outbreak of World War I, there is this gigantic explosion of economic activity. Germany was a rival of Great Britain and surpassed it in many fields, and a rival of the United States on the global scene in terms of its powerful economy. So Russia is playing this game. Whether they're going to be successful or not remains to be seen. I suspect they will, but you're going to hear howls of protest from the Nazi International, and particularly that part of it that's coming out of the Soros connected groups and all of their chicanery and things like that. So Russia now is taking very, very serious steps under Mr. Putin. And please note, this is coming at a time where Mr. Putin has also changed and dismissed many of his senior military advisors. So there's big factional shakeups going on inside the Kremlin. This is something to watch. We've seen the diplomatic achievements recently out of Moscow with patching up relations with Turkey. This is going to accelerate, in my opinion. Watch Western Europe now, because I suspect that this is going to put immense pressure on them to bypass sanctions altogether, and do so in any number of ways. I just saw an article before I did this News and Views, how European ships are being flagged with Turkish flags so that they can continue to conduct trade in the Russian ports in the Crimea and the Baltic, in the Crimea, and then along other ports on the Black Sea. So it's very interesting. The Europeans are sidestepping the sanctions, and Putin is now undertaking this. It's going to be a very, very interesting 2 years. It does drive home once again that you don't need to be caught in that globalism versus populism paradigm, that there is another alternative, and Mr. Putin appears to be willing to pursue it and give it a chance. So that's it for today's News and Views, everybody. I'll see you on the flip side. Bye-bye, and God bless.